Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from Jumpstart, Tinybones Trinket Thief. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is by Patreon. For as little as $1, patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, while higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to them both in the description too. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Tinybones is a 1/2 skeleton rogue for 1 generic and 1 black. At the beginning of each end step, you draw a card and lose 1 life if an opponent discarded a card that turn. Keep in mind that with the way this is worded, you only draw a single card whether it was one opponent or multiple opponents that discarded a card that same turn. Not only is this a great way to draw a card each end step, but if you manage to empty an opponent's hand, you can pair that with its activated ability. 6 mana might seem a bit steep, but doing so means that each opponent with an empty hand loses 10 life. Not only are we incredibly disruptive if opponents can't keep a hand in order to play cards, but we can deal a significant amount of pain to them for it. Even more so if Tinybones is equipped with Illusionist Bracers. Since this equipment copies Tinybones' activated ability, for 6 mana we can have those particular opponents lose 20 life with each activation. Now that's a lot of damage. Unfortunately, Tinybones doesn't have any built-in way to make opponents discard cards. No matter, we'll simply include those effects in this deck. Now what's important to keep in mind is being able to draw as many cards as possible from this effect. This means we have to have each opponent discard a card in their turn. Anvil of Bogarden, Bottomless Pit, Gibbering Descent, and Necrogen Mists do just that. These effects also disrupt us since they also hit us during our own upkeep. However, we have to play this deck keeping that in mind. It's merely the cost of guaranteeing drawing a card at the end of each opponent's turn. Having as many of these as possible on the battlefield also helps in keeping opponents' hands as close to 0 as possible. Painful Quandary is another way to have opponents potentially discarding cards during their turn. Opponents usually choose losing 5 life when casting that spell, but once life totals start plummeting, discarding a card becomes more viable. Either way, it's a lose-lose situation for opponents. Words of Waste is another way to disrupt opponents outside of your turn. This can be used as a very cheap way to deny opponents of a hand. When activated at the end of each turn in which you would draw a card, instead of you drawing that card, your opponents have to discard a card. Keep in mind that you won't get another Tinybones trigger that turn because of it. That being said, this is a great way to keep your opponent's hands empty. Gaia Reach Sanitarium can be activated during any turn, so it's a great way to trigger Tinybones when needed. You might get more advantage out of it during your own turn, but in a turn where your opponents didn't discard a card, make sure to activate it during their second main phase before that end of turn trigger enters the stack. Otherwise, you won't be able to get that Tinybones trigger. Although these are the best ways to get multiple triggers before your next turn, we can also guarantee a trigger at the end of our turn while still disrupting opponents. Cunning Lethomancer triggers only during our upkeep, but it has the entire table discard a card. Sure, we lose a card, but we regain it at the end of our turn, and more importantly, our opponents don't. Liliana Waker of the Dead and Liliana of the Veil are repeatable ways of doing this effect while gaining loyalty in the process. Again, we might be down a card, but then we'll regain it at the end of our turn. Liliana Waker of the Dead is also useful in spot removal with her second ability. Her emblem is amazing since it can reanimate any creature from any graveyard and give it haste too, but we'll discuss those types of effects in greater detail further along. Liliana of the Veil can also get rid of a creature with her second ability, but we don't get to choose which one. However, with opponents constantly discarding cards, more often than not, they'll probably have only one creature on the battlefield at a time anyways. Her ultimate isn't that useful in the deck, but either way we want her around more for her first 2 abilities. Rankle, Master of Pranks, and Stronghold Rats can also have the entire table discard a card during our own turn, but they have to connect with combat damage to do so. Rankle can fly, but the rats have a better evasion in the form of Shadow. Rankle doesn't have to have the table discard a card though. You can choose either of his modes depending on the situation, but more often than not, it's going to be his first option. Rotting Rats and Miasmic Mummy also have the entire table discard a card when they enter the battlefield. These are great to cast early game because they can also serve as chump blockers and or sacrifice fodder afterwards. Mindlash Sliver is another amazing early game drop and, more importantly, can be activated whenever at instant speed, so you can do so at the beginning of an opponent's main phase to take away the card they just drew, or to activate Tinybones at the end of a turn that isn't yours. Speaking of sacrifice fodder, Smallpox is another way to have the entire table discard a card for very cheap. Not only that, but it also has the table lose 1 life as well as sacrifice a creature and a land. When cast early enough, this can really set back players with early game mana dorks since they lose both the dork and a land. Mind Ray can be used to have a single player discard 2 cards, but where's the fun in that? This spell is meant to be overloaded in order to really get opponents' hands empty so that we can eventually activate Tinybones. Fortunately, not all of the deck's discard effects affect us. Unnerve, Arterial Flow, and Tessagur's Cruelty all have opponents discarding 2 cards. There are only 3 vampires in the entire deck in order to make the most of Arterial Flow, but that's fine since what we care about most is having our opponents discard 2 cards. We can also make only opponents discard cards with Vicious Rumors and Siphon Mind. As a bonus, Vicious Rumors mills all opponents for 1 as well. Siphon Mind will also draw us 3 cards, so it's possibly the best discard sorcery in the deck. Burglar Rat and Liliana's Spectre have only opponents discard a card when entering the battlefield. Just like the previous creatures with a similar ability, getting these out early is a great way to have jump blockers and or sacrifice outlets. Herald of Anguish is the last discard effect in the deck. The good news is that it only affects opponents when it triggers. The bad news is that it triggers during our end step, so Tinybones won't be able to trigger that turn just because of it. Opponents would have had to discard a card before our end step in order for Tinybones to trigger. Either way, it still has opponents discarding a card. It's also a 5/5 flyer for 7 mana that can actually be cast for much cheaper since it has Improvise. There are 13 artifacts in the deck, so it can be cast very easily for cheap. Now, is Tinybones the only way to make the most out of all of this discarding? No, there's more. Bone Miser and Waste Not have the same effect, with the former relating to yours and the latter to your opponent's discard. Even though you might have to discard along with opponents, these effects might create zombies for you to overwhelm the table with, generate mana to keep chaining into spells, especially since they also provide card draw. Since Tinybones does have you lose 1 life whenever it triggers, Sangromancer helps counteract that and more. Whenever an opponent discards a card, you gain 3 life, but then only lose 1 when Tinybones triggers. So this definitely helps in getting your life much higher as well to buffer any damage from other sources. Gaining 3 life from opponents' creatures dying as well is just icing on the cake. In fact, Archfiend of Ifnir helps in killing off those creatures. Whenever you discard a card, you put a -1/-1 counter on all creatures your opponents control. This is why it's not such a bad thing if we're discarding so many of our own cards. We undoubtedly draw them back with Tinybones, but we can also wipe opponents' boards as well. Sir Conrad the Grim also takes double advantage of this because not only will he trigger when creatures are dying, but he'll also trigger when they're getting discarded. Not only that, but it's each opponent. So if each opponent discarded a creature card, then each opponent receives 3 damage. He's also a 5/4, which gives him quite the body as well. Speaking of bodies, the Haunt of Hightower can become incredibly huge in this deck. It gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a card goes into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere. So 1 mass discard effect and it gets 3 of those counters. On top of that, it makes an opponent discard a card just by attacking them. If that weren't enough, it has Flying and Lifelink, which also helps in counteracting the life we lose to Tinybones' triggered ability. We can also take even more advantage of our opponents discarding things by stealing their creatures. Animate Dead, Sepulchral Primordial, Dredge the Mire, and Rise of the Dark Realms are some amazing reanimation effects in this deck. Usually, the first thing to be discarded away is a fatty since they won't be cast anytime soon early in the game. That's when Animate Dead can get you a huge creature early on, especially if it's one of yours that you discarded early on. Dredge the Mire and the Primordial can get a creature from each opponent's graveyard, with the sorcery only being limited in the sense that your opponents choose what you get. No matter though, since it's cheap to cast and you're getting 3 creatures from it. Rise of the Dark Realms is definitely a closer in the deck since this is usually cast in the late game, but casting this with a graveyard full of creatures can spell imminent doom for opponents if they don't deal with it. The deck does have Leyline of the Void, which clearly nombos with a couple of these cards in the deck, but it's included in case we face any Reanimator decks, which is common enough since it's a popular archetype. Having these decks discard creatures actually does them a favor, so play it only when against such decks. If we don't get access to all of those lovely creatures to steal, Ensnaring Bridge helps us out in combat since opponents will have such a small hand, as do we, that more often than not they won't be able to attack us at all. Granted, this also affects us as well, but Tinybones has a built-in win con with its activated ability. Either way, we can still win with cards like Grey Merchant of Asphodel and Exsanguinate, which are in the deck. Not only are these more ways of gaining tons of life to deal with losing life throughout the match, but they also have the potential of eliminating opponents as well. As for not wanting to lose any cards we're discarding away, the deck has Library of Leng and Bag of Holding. With Library of Leng, we discard to the top of our library and as a bonus get no maximum hand size, which is quite handy if we're managing to draw 4 cards each turn thanks to Tinybones. Bag of Holding is great in not top decking the card but keeping them exiled until we need them back later. It can also loot as a bonus, which is great in a pinch. Costing only 1 mana means they're amazing turn 1 drops or getting them out in the early game. Just be careful with anyone blowing up your bag if it's holding a lot of goodies. Discarding Ulamog the Infinite Gyre is a great way to recover a lot of your discarded cards. Your graveyard will get shoveled back into your library, but at least you can continue digging through your deck that way and also reusing your spells. Ulamog is also a 10/10 with Indestructible and Annihilator Fort that destroys any permanent when cast, so it's safe to say it has its other uses too. On the topic of destroying any permanent, sure, the deck is annoyingly disruptive by having your opponents constantly discarding cards. But even with an empty hand, they might top deck something problematic for you that they were able to cast before you had a chance to make them discard it. They might cast these creatures with the hopes of keeping them around for a turn in order to attack us because maybe we're tapped out or only have a couple of cards in our hands as well. Though there's no better way to take that joy away from them than with Snuff Out, Slaughter Pact, and Deadly Rollick, since they can be cast for free and at instant speed. Being able to cast them for free means we can continue keeping our mana open to activate Tinybones the moment as many opponents as possible have no cards in their hands. Liliana Dreadhorde General is another amazing way to take those creatures away since her -4 ability has the entire table sacrificing 2 creatures, so it's a good thing we have so much sacrifice fodder in the deck. Even then, her first ability gives us a chump blocker and sacrifice fodder. Her static ability is also amazing since we draw cards when our creatures die. Her ultimate isn't that important in the deck, so we don't really build up to it. We care more about zombie production and sacrifices. And if there's too many creatures on the board, Damnation, Toxic Deluge, Dead of Winter, and Mutilate can help with that. The first one is a straightforward board wipe, but the last 3 are great at bypassing Indestructible. With the deck having 21 snow-covered swamps, you're more than likely to wipe the board with these last 2 spells, especially since the deck is running all 5 possible fetch lands that also serve to thin the deck of lands, making our draws more efficient as well as getting those basics onto the battlefield. Speaking of mana, the deck is running Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, and Soul Ring to not only help get a decent lead at the beginning of the game, but to make it easier to activate Tinybones. Although Tinybones only costs 2 to cast, its ability is a whopping 6 mana, so we need a lot of cheap acceleration. Nyx Lotus and Nykthos Shrine to Nyx can also help with this since our devotion to black is going to be very high by the time we're able to begin activating Tinybones to start eliminating opponents. Cabal Stronghold and Cabal Coffers can similarly be activated to generate a ton of black mana, the coffins in particular when combined with Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth. As mentioned earlier, the deck is running 21 snow-covered swamps, so there's definitely going to be a lot of black mana to go around. Magus of the Coffers is basically Cabal Coffers on a body, so it's included as a redundant effect to allow it for lots of explosive plays thanks to the amount of swamps we control. Liliana of the Dark Realms can help with this even further to guarantee us getting a swamp each turn. Her other abilities are also incredibly useful, her emblem in particular, since it can have our swamps generate an obscene amount of black mana, which Tinybones will love to receive, as with the Exsanguinate mentioned earlier. Nirkana Revenant and Crypt Gas can also be used to maximize our swamps by making them tap for an additional black mana. As a bonus, the Revenant functions as a mana sink that can potentially take out an opponent, and the Gas has Extort, which can also help us give another way to drain the table and recover lots of life due to what Tinybones is losing us. We can also get more swamps onto the battlefield thanks to Solemn Simulacrum and Burnished Heart. We don't have access to much land-based ramp effects, but at least these do the trick. Sadabot is a great sacrifice fodder as well, and the Heart triggers anything that cares about our creatures dying. We can also guarantee land drops thanks to Crucible of Worlds. If we have nothing better to discard than a land, we can just play it from the graveyard, thus negating our discard, so we don't lose tempo like the rest of the table does. It also pairs great with the fetch lands in the deck, just be wary of your life total. Deserted Temple is included to not only be able to reactivate those lands mentioned earlier that tap for a lot of mana, but can also be used with more mana generating lands in the deck like Lake of the Dead, Ancient Tomb, and Temple of the False God. Lake of the Dead is amazing since the swamp doesn't need to be sacrificed. That means you can tap it down for mana before sacrificing it, meaning you can get 5 black mana from this interaction. Sword of Feast and Famine allows us to tap out in our pre-combat main phase to make the most of our mana, since we'll then be able to untap all of our lands if the creature connects. With Stronghold Rats having Shadow, this would be the best creature to equip it. Oh, and not only that, but the opponent has to discard a card as well, triggering Tinybones at the end of our turn. So this sword is the best one for this deck. Jet Medallion simply reduces the generic cost of our black spells, which is pretty much the same as paying for it, which is great, especially in the early game. Even then, with all the sources of life gain in the deck, Keurig, Son of Yawgmoth makes it so we can just use life instead of mana to pay for those black costs. Keurig himself also has lifelink and gets bigger with every black spell we cast, meaning that he's also a great source of gaining life and dealing damage. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Tinybones Trinket Thief. This is a very straightforward deck when you're disrupting your opponents as much as possible with having them discard a lot of cards and keeping them at close to no cards in their hand as possible, all while taking advantage of the cards both they're discarding as well as yourself. Not entirely dependent on Tinybones, the deck does have other viable win cons that can be easily assembled while being annoying to your opponents. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my high tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.